Well, you know who I am. I'm Simon, introducing Ruth, Deakin Crick, also from the UK. And we're going to talk to you about how it's possible for learning analytics to get to grips with quite a tough concept, which is the sort of attitudes and dispositions and values that learners bring to their learning. I'm going to give you a heads-up warning that we're going to do an interactive live Twitter crowdsourcing experiment halfway through. So get your machines out, tune to the #LAK12 channel, because we're going to invite some input from you for a very rapid session. Okay, here's the outline. In one slide, in case your lunch is starting to kick in, message number one, learning dispositions really do matter when we're talking about learner engagement, and we'll be saying a bit about that. It is possible to model these in a computationally formal way, which of course is the key requirement for learning analytics. And we're modeling it as a multidimensional construct called learning power, which Ruth's been developing for the last decade or so. But it also connects to the world of analytics now because there's a platform that hosts these apps and it pools data from all over the world from learners, generates real-time analytics, manages permissions for different stakeholders, and supports deeper kinds of research analytics as well. We're going to talk about the criteria for validating this kind of work, but we think arguably criteria for validating learning analytics more broadly. What does it mean to validate analytics? And it depends on who we're talking about and what the purposes and context are. And then we'll go through ongoing and future directions that this work is taking. Okay, so first of all, dispositions matter. A couple of quotes. John Dewey, that leading practitioner of learning analytics, wrote, "Knowledge of methods alone will not suffice. There must be the desire, the will to employ them. This desire is an affair of personal disposition." So as early as when he was working, he's thinking, what is it inside the learner, the intrinsic attitudes that they bring? Without that, we're preaching on deaf ears. From Bauman, the philosopher, this is a slightly more challenging quote. "Educational philosophy and theory face the unfamiliar and challenging task of theorizing a formative process which is not guided from the start by the target form designed in advance." Okay, so what that means is that we are used to deciding what the learning outcome will be, and then we define your trajectory to get there. And in the new paradigm for learning that we're having to get to grips with in a very complex, uncertain world, we're trying to create learners who don't necessarily know what the end result's got to be, or they're going to have to navigate very choppy, turbulent waters to get there and use a lot of internal resources to get there. And some of the most exciting pedagogies in schools and universities are inquiry forms of learning, where actually the teacher or the educator doesn't know what the outcome's going to be, because the student, the learner, is owning it themselves. What does it mean to design for that? Why do dispositions matter? Because there are some really scary figures now about the levels of disengagement in the developed countries' education systems. Okay, we just flashed a couple up here about disengagement in secondary school level, from Canada, from England, from the US, that's in universities, US as well. People are just switching off. They're coming into school, they're coming into college, and they are not being engaged, right? Why that is a complex story, but we've got a serious problem. And the 21st century competencies, and there are various kinds of lists of what these are, these reflect the urgent need to build learners who've got the capacity to cope with unprecedented levels of uncertainty and challenge. And here are some of the buzzwords up there. I'm not going to go through each of them. But a lot of these are to do with people who are able to dig within themselves, to be resilient when challenged, etc., and to be creative and work around the traditional boundaries. Team working, problem solving, thinking about how they learn as learners and improving that themselves. Read John Seeley Brown and The New Culture of Learning for a great, very readable introduction to why passion is one of the key things for the 21st century paradigm for learning. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Ruth now, who's going to introduce this notion of disposition a little more carefully.
Using the term disposition in quite a general way, its dictionary meaning is a relatively enduring tendency to behave in a certain way. So we're looking at how people typically behave. But we know that dispositions don't come out of thin air. They're linked importantly to identity, to affect, to what happens inside a person and what happens in the culture within which a person belongs, their home culture, and also what goes on in the classroom and the sort of pedagogical technologies that shape what is possible and what isn't possible. And we're particularly focusing on dispositions, how they can change, and how we can support learners in developing dispositions which actually enable them to engage with learning opportunities where the target form isn't known in advance. How can we create effective, intentional, lifelong learners who can self-regulate their processes of learning? A couple of pieces of background. There are two key processes, I think, that we're dealing with here. One has to do with knowledge, and that's the vertical axis here on this knowledge agency window. The sequencing of somebody's encounter with knowledge or information is critically important, and traditionally the knowledge is pre-packaged by experts, and our national curricula package knowledge up in certain ways, and good teachers know how to get that knowledge into the kids in the most effective way possible. At the other end of the spectrum, there's the process of knowledge generation and use, where a learner defines their purpose, identifies the resources they need, harnesses them, and generates new knowledge which is useful in an authentic context. So that provides the vertical axis. And linked to that, along the bottom, has to do with agency. Who's in control here? So at this end of the spectrum, the teacher tells the student what to do, what to learn, how to learn it, and when to perform. And that's a fairly traditional approach to pedagogy. At the other end of that spectrum, the student is able to take responsibility for their own learning process over time. And what we want to do is understand how to operate in that top right quadrant, where authenticity, agency, and identity are important learning resources, and teaching is learning design rather than performing to a script. And it's not that the transmission approach to knowledge is not important. There are some things that should be taught like that, but actually we need to be able to move seamlessly between these windows, and I think our learning analytics needs to be able to do the same. Another important concept is that learning is complex. It's a complex dynamic process that involves internal processes and external processes. And there are at least 4 stations on a learning journey that are critically important. Identity, linked to who I am, story, desire, motivation, and relationships. If we don't attend to that in our learning, then we are missing out on something quite important. The next layer is learning power, and within that layer we position dispositions, the personal qualities that you need to engage with a learning opportunity. Then we have what we more traditionally understand as curriculum, the knowledge, skills and understanding, which in the UK are very carefully defined. And finally we have competence, how to use all the above in a real-world context. And our learning design and learning analytics needs to be able to take all of these aspects of learning into account. So learning power is a term has become used in practice to define clusters of dispositions, values and attitudes that enable people to engage with learning opportunities. And if you like metaphors, this is a metaphor of DNA. When we're teaching, 2 things are happening. We're focusing on the knowledge, skills and understanding that are the focus of the learning, and we're also teaching people to love or to hate that learning. So we're promoting values, attitudes and dispositions towards learning. And learning power or learning dispositions is what holds the 2 strands of the double helix together. So the research that we began in 2000, before I'd ever heard of the word learning analytics, was twofold. Firstly, in a traditional social science way, could we identify the qualities and characteristics of people who are effective learners? And we went through a pretty standard research process, drawing on experts, a meta-analysis of literature, and specifically practitioners, to create a survey question, which then went through several iterative factor analytic processes, which resulted firstly with 2,000 cases, and that resulted in 7 key qualities or factors, which we subsequently identified as learning power. And this is where we're going to do the Twitter thing. So I'm going to hand over to Simon.
Okay, fine. So before we tell you the answer, we're going to ask you to think about the qualities of the most effective learners that you've ever had the joy and privilege of trying to teach. Okay? Not necessarily the high-flying academic ones that always got the A's, okay? But the ones who are engaged, who seem to have skill and ability to progress, and they went on to do very well in real-world, authentic contexts, okay? And we're just going to invite you to go into Twitter now and tweet in some of the key qualities that make for the most effective learners in your experience, okay? So we've got like 15 seconds. Go to Twitter, think about what characterizes these kinds of people, and we'll take a look at what that looks like. So I'm just going to refresh that page, and we'll see what comes up. Okay, we've done this a few times. Sorry, Brandon says tenacity. Just going to keep refreshing this. I've done this in a couple of webinars with Educores, and it works quite well. Actually, if I go into... okay, here we go. Motivation, focus, questioning. They take the initiative. They don't wait to be handed. Engagement, persistence, enthusiasm. It's flooding in. I can't keep up. Okay, so passion, curiosity, self-awareness. They're excited by learning. They're persistent. Okay, self-motivation, a willingness to experiment. Okay, that's what we're talking about. All right, so you know this stuff. The question is, how do we do that with learning analytics? Okay, back to Ruth.
Okay, so I think good social science always makes common sense to people, and you just demonstrated that once again. What emerged from our studies and now has been replicated with over 50,000 cases are these 7 qualities which have an emergent pole and a contrast pole. So we want to move from being stuck and static to being hopeful about our ability to change and learn. I'm going to go through them one by one in just a minute. A couple of points about them. They are dispositions, but they include feeling and thinking. They're not learning styles, okay? And in actual fact, fragility and dependence is what emerged out of the data. That's what we actually measure, but we don't tell people how fragile and dependent they are. We actually work with the other end of the scale, which is resilience. So there are the 7 dimensions of learning power. Resilience is about tenacity, sticking with a problem, knowing that you can repair your mood if you have a challenge, if you need to, managing the feelings of learning, and so on. Strategic awareness is about metacognition, thinking about learning, but also managing the feelings of learning, knowing that if you stick with confusion, then that's probably a good thing because eventually you'll learn and you manage that process. Critical curiosity is what it sounds like. Effective learners don't make quiet classes. They challenge. They want to get beneath the surface. They generate lots of questions. Creativity is a general notion of creativity which has to do with playfulness, imagination and intuition, and basically thinking outside of the box. And we know that creativity is the worst casualty in all of our data. It plummets as children go through school, funnily enough. Meaning-making is the opposite of just accumulating data. It's about making sense of data, not only 2 bits of data to make something new, but learning that matters to me in my story and in my community. Changing and learning is about hopefulness and a Dweckian concept of hope and optimism that I can engage with new learning opportunities, as opposed to thinking, well, I'm just a level 5 and that's all I'm ever going to be, which is stuck and static. And finally, learning relationships. Positive learning relationships are when you're able to be both interdependent and independent. rather than either dependent or isolated. So we have these 7 dimensions of learning power. And is this me or you, Simon, at this point?
Me.
So this is where Simon does the next bit.
Okay, this is where Simon does the next bit. Okay, so a well-grounded notion of where, of how one might conceptualize this collection of attitudes and dispositions. How would one gather this stuff at scale and generate feedback in a timely way? And this is a platform called the Learning Warehouse. It's got a whole bunch of data sets in it, around about 40 to 50,000 actually, coming up to 50 perhaps, different LE profiles from students and learners all over the world, school and adults. There are other apps hosted on the Learning Warehouse other than just LE, the tool for gathering this data. The ability to generate reports, we'll show you what they look like in a minute, as well as to support researchers who are digging more deeply using a researcher interface. And then, of course, there's a user experience at the front end, and depending on who you are as a user, you get different views. So what you do is, through self-report, answer a questionnaire, a sort of web quiz. And you can see, for example, here, talking things through with my colleagues helps me to learn. No, not at all like me, a little bit like me, quite a lot, or very much like me. Okay? So you go through and you think about your learning and answer the questions. What you get back is a 7-legged spider diagram, which gives you in sort of blue shaded outline. And that's then the basis of a mentored discussion with somebody who understands what these things mean, about what that might mean. Do you feel that you own this? Okay? Because if the learner doesn't own it, then we need to think about what that might mean. And then what interventions might we make off the back of that. The red line shows the result after doing some work for one of these particular learners. Okay? And you can imagine if you've got a very scrunched up profile, that could be quite crushing. Right? So we don't just give these to the students and wish them good luck. It's very important about educator support and scaffolding. Although the notion of peer mentoring around this is quite an interesting one for scaling this up. And you get cohort data, so a teacher gets to see their class. And even the high achievers might actually be very brittle and not very good when challenged and stretched out of their comfort zone. And you can kind of view that in different ways. Okay? So it sort of informs organizational and leadership strategic change. So we're talking about learners who do the profile, administrators who can upload additional metadata about the students, the learners, educators and leaders who are trying to sense what are the implications of this, either for my school, my class, my organization. This is starting to be used in the workplace as well. And researchers who, with the right permissions, can come in and do cross-data set analyses, compare it with other data sets, etc. And there's a social enterprise spun out to then service this. So doing bespoke organizational analyses, analysis of data across a particular cohort of organizations, like a network who are all working, experimenting with new pedagogies, the Learning Futures Network in England. There's a collaborative data analysis service, and then you can do secondary analysis and say, is there any correspondence or correlation between what I'm seeing in learning power and other indices of attainment? Okay. Right, moving swiftly on, what does it mean to validate this?
So one of the challenges that I've struggled with really for 12 years has been using the same data set for different purposes and thereby transgressing just about all boundaries in my discipline of education because there are different truth paradigms or quality criteria for the different ways in which we use data. So, for example, the large data sets that we analyse in social science, and I guess this applies to you in learning analytics as well, what really matters is empirical analytical quality criteria. When we've identified the learning power profiles of underachieving students, we want to know whether the analyses that we've done are replicable across the whole population. Can we generalise from this traditional scientific approaches to the data? And we've been able to do quite a lot. We now know quite a lot about learning power and how it operates, at least in the UK and several other countries. The second sort of level of use of the data is hermeneutical, interpreting the data. And that has a different set of quality criteria. So how somebody interprets, how a teacher interprets what this class cohort set of profiles means is an act of interpretation. There's not necessarily a single right answer. We can't say with absolute certainty it is this. And the person with authority to make that judgment is different from those that make authority judgments in traditional social science. And then finally, the spider diagram is a framework for a coaching conversation that moves between the identity of the learner and their purpose in learning. And that's emancipatory rationality. The purpose there is to enable a person to flourish and reach their full potential. So these are three significantly different forms of rationality based on Habermas, in case any of you recognise that, which we have to work with. And working with these different forms of truth criteria is challenging. So empirical analytical criteria, it's reliability, validity, and there are all sorts of different forms of validity that you probably know very well about. Hermeneutical criteria, however, reliability and validity is replaced with trustworthiness. In the light of all the evidence, do we find this to be a trustworthy judgment that we're making about why our year nines are so disengaged? Okay? And then when it comes to emancipatory rationality, it's very different again. It's about who's speaking for whom, attention to voice, critical reflexivity, undistorted communication. And I think this challenge of dealing with different truth claims has always been a challenge with the LE work, and I suspect it's a challenge for learning analytics as well, because it's so intensely pragmatic.
Okay, so where are we going next with this? As you've heard, this is working off data about how learners see themselves. Okay? That LE profile is how I see myself. I don't see myself as very creative, or I do see myself as quite resilient. Okay? What we're trying to do with Learning Warehouse 3, for want of a better name at the moment, is add data streams as well as data sets gained through fairly traditional educational social science paradigms. Okay? Data streams coming in from live social learning applications. I'll just add the whole layer there. Okay? So we've got new kinds of apps at the top here, which are going to generate new kinds of analytics, possibly open up the possibility for recommendation engines to act, the kinds of things that we're interested in here in the learning analytics world. Using simulations as well, based on notions of learning power and how good practice spreads. Okay. Collective intelligence we've put in there as well, because we're bringing technologies in from the work that I do, which allows a community of practice to share what they're doing with this kind of approach in more sort of powerful ways than simply on traditional network forums and so forth. So this is the sort of ecosystem we're trying to create now as we take this work forward. So very quickly then, a blogging platform, WordPress, but we've added some plugins. There's this one specifically around LE, so that when the learner is blogging as in Inquiry Blogger about their learning journey, they're actually categorizing it as, I think I'm exercising resilience here. I'm demonstrating critical curiosity. You can see a mood view there, which just says, my mood is plummeted on this project right now. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? The question is, what are you going to do with that? Are you going to pieces now, or have you got resources where you know what to do when you don't know what to do? And there's the Educator Dashboard that gives you the Gestalt collective view. We've got a tool for mentoring at scale that's being prototyped called Element, where the learner and the mentor can look at the diagram and reflect on what's going on in text chat, or you can open up the Skype window as well, of course, talk about it, agree an intervention, and then revisit that later on. Social Learn is a platform just rolling out within the OU at the moment and shortly to the world. Similar in flavour to the landing, I think, for those of you who heard John Dron's presentation. And we're trying to define analytics in Social Learn, which, rather than just saying what I think I'm doing, what kind of LE profile could a platform generate from what I actually do? So that's work in progress at the moment, but we're trying to define what would a sign of resilience be? What would a sign of critical curiosity be? And then even more interesting but tough, could we actually formalize what a mentor does into some code rules? Ethical and all sorts of problems there. So we'll stop there. Learningemergence.net is the place to come if you're interested in taking this discussion forward, and very happy to take a couple of questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much. Are we on? Hi. This is wonderful stuff. One of the things that I'm always concerned with students working at a distance and coming at learning from all kinds of different backgrounds is their use of time, their constructive use of time. And I'm just wondering if you've got any field test data yet with actual students and whether they find this as a meaningful use of their time, or whether they find it's much too distracting and just takes them away from the tasks at hand.
The way LE is mostly used is a combination of the learning analytics and the face-to-face. And when it's skillfully used, then the analytics that come from LE are focused on a particular purpose. And so I think they focus a person's time and provide scaffolding for the journey to a product. And that's the whole purpose of the Learning Power profile. With adults, we've worked with 14 British universities, and I think the same thing applies, that because it provides a scaffolding, it actually enables focus. So when people might normally just give up, they can say, look at their, if it's a child, look at their spider diagram and say, well, actually, I need to use my creativity here. How many different things could I think of to do to get myself away from this stuck point? So used skillfully, I think it's a time saver. Used unskillfully, it's disastrous like any other pedagogical tool.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the interpretation aspect? I was interested in what this means in terms of a teacher interpreting the spider diagrams or the other elements that are presented to them and what they do with that.
We've always maintained from the beginning that the person who has the authority to validate an individual spider diagram is the learner themselves, because at the end of the day, when we're using large numbers and you've got mean scores across large populations, you can be confident about what you're saying in that context. But when it comes to an individual, it's actually an act of interpretation. So you don't know whether mum and dad broke up last night. That's why when they came to do their profile, it was a really wrinkly prune all stuck in the middle. And so therefore there is an act of, so the analytic is one bit of data that a skilled teacher as learning designer takes into account in making an interpretation.
A couple of thoughts on that. I mean, we've had quite, so if we think about how we're going to implement this as a model that could underpin analytics, that creates some interesting challenges for us, right? Because it means that the platform may or may not be able to make good decisions about what to recommend to me. So one of the really interesting questions right now that we're wrestling with is, what's the relationship between a profile that's from self-report versus one that's from behavioral data by the traces I leave behind in the platform. It might be that they're not actually quite the same, but what would that mean? That would be interesting. It might mean that I don't think of myself like this, but the platform thinks actually I'm demonstrating that ability. Or it might be that the platform's just confused, of course. And then the whole mentoring and interpretation thing, should we basically depend on human mentors or can we do peer mentoring and buddying, which of course would scale very nicely in a social kind of platform. So it's the whole ecosystem about what a representation like this means to a machine and what it might mean to a human as well.
Okay, well, can you please join me
Can I ask a question? So I want to know what you know right now about using it skillfully. You talked about how it's very useful when used skillfully, but what's that mean?
You mean what are the components of being skillful as a practitioner?
Skillful in using this profile to help somebody become a better learner.
Well, I suppose in a nutshell, it would be teachers who see, or facilitators who see teaching as learning design rather than following a script. So rather than, here's the curriculum, and we've got to get it into the kids, and it's actually a transmission process. It's about saying, here's a context, here's a purpose, these are the objectives, and the teacher needs to use all of that data in order to make pedagogical judgments and use their professional discernment in the process of teaching, rather than simply...
That's what I'm asking. I'm asking about what that means. I mean, you're at this way high level. Oh, yeah, people who know how to do that. But what's it mean to know how to do that?
For a teacher?
Yeah, for anybody. I mean, what do we know about that? What do we know about promoting disposition and about doing that skillfully?
Okay, so we know that the quality of relationships is absolutely critical to a conversation with somebody about their learning power. The quality of trust, which we don't, is hard to measure, but everybody knows whether it's there or not, is a critical quality of a pedagogical relationship if that conversation needs to happen. We know that learning power contributes to knowledge structuring processes quite critically in terms of inquiry-based learning. Do you want to?
I think we should probably stop for time.
Yeah.
But
We've got a little bit over time. I think that's probably a presentation in itself.
Yes, it is.
We have a conversation